Good afternoon. I'm Fiona Aldridge, Director of Policy and Research at Learning and Work Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. And we have a fabulous line of contributors to discuss the really pressing issue around how we improve the employment prospects of young people after coronavirus. Now, today's event is particularly timely with labour market data released earlier today showing that young people continue to be amongst the hardest hit. They now account for 50% of the fall in employment that we've seen during the crisis, despite the fact that they only account for around 12% of total employment. Today's figures also show that there are now over 500,000 16 to 24-year-olds claiming unemployment-related benefits, which are double the pre-crisis levels. And the number of young people who are unemployed for 6 months or so has also increased again, and we're up 51% on this time last year. So we definitely need to act now if we are going to address the challenges that we face. And I'm delighted that we get the opportunity to discuss this today. Now, during the event, we'll be exploring the findings of some new research from Learning and Work Institute and Prince's Trust, supported by HSBC, into the employment prospects of young people after coronavirus. Our research explores the future path of youth employment after the pandemic, and for the first time it sets out the economic and fiscal costs of high levels of youth unemployment that we face. I'm going to be outlining, first of all, some of the key findings of the research. But before I do that, I would like to encourage you to take part in this poll, which we'll put up on the screen. During my presentation, if you respond to the poll on Slido, and also if you could put your questions as we go, and we will come back to these as we go through into the panel discussion. So on to the next slide, please. So as you will see from this slide, throughout the crisis, the pandemic has triggered a labour market crisis which is hitting young people hard. And what you can see from this slide is that we've had a bigger spike in claimant count among young people than we have seen in recent years. It's unprecedented in recent decades. Young people account for around 2/3 of the total fall in employment since the start of the pandemic, and youth unemployment is around 4 times higher than the rest of the working age population. And among young people more broadly, we know that some groups have been more affected by others. So those with low qualifications or no qualifications and Black young people have been hit particularly hard. And we risk compounding labour market inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, as well as losing their jobs, young people have been more likely to have other impacts on their working lives. So while the coronavirus pandemic has had a huge impact overall, we've seen a greater impact on sectors in which young people are typically overrepresented. So those sectors at the top of this chart: wholesale, retail, accommodation, and food services. Next slide, please. And what this means is that as well as losing their jobs, young people have also been substantially more likely to see a reduction in their working hours or to have been furloughed. During that first lockdown, as you can see from the chart, 47% of all young workers were furloughed. Now, of course, while many young people then returned to work over the summer as through flexible furlough and as the economy picked up again and restrictions were loosened, what we saw in October to December as new restrictions were introduced is those furlough claims doubling again. Now, the great news is progress with rolling out the vaccine programme is enabling us to reopen some of those sectors that have been hardest hit. But there's a real risk, of course, that many businesses will be permanently affected, resulting in closure or reduced operating capacity and staffing. And employers in our research say that they're now hiring fewer young people as a proportion of their new recruits. We also surveyed 2,000 young people in January this year, and only 16% said that their employment had not been impacted by the pandemic, whether that's losing their jobs, being furloughed, reduced hours, having job offers withdrawn, for example. Now, all of this analysis has been well documented by us and by others. On our next slide, we see that our recent report with Prince's Trust has sought not only to look at this immediate impact of the pandemic, but also to look at the potential impact in the medium and long term. And we modelled future employment demand. And what it suggests is that while overall employment will recover in the medium to long term, young people will continue to face significant labour market disadvantage. And that's because they tend to be overrepresented in those sectors which will recover underrepresented in those sectors that will recover more rapidly, and overrepresented in those sectors that will recover more slowly or perhaps not at all. And in addition to the impact on young people themselves, our economic modelling presented here in this table highlights the significant impact both on the wider economy and on public finances. So high youth unemployment is expected to lead to an immediate economic output and a hit to national output in this year of £5.9 billion, but that continues to peak at £6.9 billion in 2022, and then still at £2.1 billion by the time we get to 2025. Then when we look at the impact on public finances, which is in the form of lower tax revenues and higher benefit spending, again, we see an impact of £2.5 billion this year, peaking at £2.9 billion next year and falling to still £1 billion in 2025. And then finally, we know that young people who face a period of unemployment when young will see an impact on their chances of being in paid work and on their wages for many years to come. And this long-run scarring effect for those entering the labour market this year alone, we estimate will total £14.4 billion over the next 7 years. And in the face of these figures, doing nothing is clearly unacceptable. So on the next slide, it's evident that we need to act, but of course our goal shouldn't simply be to return to where we were pre-pandemic. Even prior to the crisis, young people in England on average had poorer basic skills like literacy and numeracy than in many other countries, and also were more likely to have lower qualification levels. And there are also stark inequalities across England. And we have seen some progress, but that progress is starting to slow down in recent years. So if we're going to build back better, to coin a phrase, then we need to have a higher ambition for the education and employment of our young people, rather than just seeking to return to where we were pre-COVID. Next slide. So in terms of acting, our report has 3 types of recommendations, or 3 areas of recommendations. We've talked about protecting jobs. So the furlough scheme has been crucial in protecting jobs throughout the crisis, and we need to support young people who are on furlough to update their skills and retrain if necessary. We also need to ensure that any restrictions reimposed on the economy are matched with similar protections through a furlough scheme as we go throughout the year. Secondly, we have been calling for a youth guarantee. There have been a range of government measures already announced to support young people, and these are welcome. But we believe that there's a need for a more coherent approach to make sure that young people have the right support, but also that they don't fall through the gaps. And so we've called for a clear and simple offer to ensure that all young people who are unemployed or not in education can access a job, an apprenticeship, an education, or a training place. And then thirdly, we need to ensure that jobs are available for young people to step into, and that they get their share of the economic recovery that we're building. So we need to promote job creation and ensure that young people have access to those opportunities as they arise. And that could be through building employment support and training into public investment, but also thinking about where we have hiring subsidies for employers who are taking on unemployed young people. Hopefully throughout the discussion, we will get your views on those actions, what we need to do more of, where we need to be more coherent, and how we need to make sure that these are really timely and available for young people now. But I will stop there on the presentation, and I'm really keen to hear from all of our contributors. So first of all, I would like to invite Damien Hines to talk to us very much about kind of facing the future after the pandemic. Damien, as many of you will know, has been former Employment Minister and Secretary of State for Education. So I think quite uniquely able to bring both the employment and education aspects of our support for young people together. Damien, can I hand over to you, please?
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, for inviting me to be with you today, and also thank you to the Prince's Trust for all the work that you do, and to HSBC as well for your support for the report on this event today. I very much welcome the report. I think it's timely and it's important to be talking about exactly these matters, and I'll touch on some of the report's recommendations in my remarks. It's clear that while older people have been the biggest victims of COVID-19 in terms of health and risk to life, it's the young who've been disproportionately hit in employment, as well as, of course, as we all recognise, in education. And there are effects which, frankly, I think we're only really beginning to understand fully throughout the age range from birth into young adulthood. There's been a lot of focus on GCSE and A-level cohorts, but actually at every sort of transition stage in particular for young people, there have been issues, and that includes career starters who have had the start of their working life disrupted. It also includes, by the way, those who otherwise would be thinking about making their first significant job change and moving on in their career, because so many of these things have been impeded. And as the report makes clear, and Fiona was just covering, young people in the workforce have been overrepresented in so-called shutdown sectors. And while the most obvious immediate effects are in schooling and in jobs, I think we also need to see the broader picture as well, that actually a lot of what people have lost out on is things like sport and enriching activities, and just the human development that comes for all of us as a result of being with other people. And all these effects, again, as the report rightly says, have happened unevenly through our country, and by the way, in other countries as well, with big questions for social mobility and social justice and social cohesion. Now, when I speak to school leaders, they're always careful to remind me that politicians and others shouldn't use terms like lost generation or COVID generation, because that isn't going to do anything good for anybody's mental health and positive outlook. But clearly, these are big issues that we are going to be grappling with for years to come. Right now, we have the immediate term employment situation to consider, and it is often the case in the past that young people bear the greatest brunt when there is an economic downturn. And as Fiona said, the scarring effect of having been out of work when young can last far into adult life. And that scarring effect is true also, I would say, at a societal level, an economy-wide level. We just can't afford not to be using all the talent, all the ability, all the energy of a cohort of people. I think Stephen will probably talk especially about labour market policies, which he brings a great expertise to. And there's an obvious risk point that we will come to as furlough draws to a close, which of course it must in time. And I'm sure that DWP and the Treasury will be carefully considering and keeping under review the specs and the timing and the eligibility criteria for the various programmes. I was going to talk mostly, Fiona, about skills for jobs, enabling everybody to reach their potential and to drive the productivity growth that we need to underpin wage growth. You rightly said, Fiona, that of course COVID isn't the only thing that's happening, and there is always a broader context. There are always more factors, and we need to consider the pre-existing context for young people in terms of employment, both what's happened in the past, what's been happening in the most recent past, and also what expectations were already for changes coming up in the marketplace. And I mean, that starts with productivity. And we have, I mean, ever since I was born, literally since I was born, we have had and before, we've had a yawning productivity gap with some of our key comparator nations. That's true of the whole economy. but particularly comes into play when we talk about certain sectors of the economy, including some in which young people are particularly represented. As Fiona said, there are too many young people in this country who don't reach what's called level 3 of qualifications, the equivalent to A level or T level, a smaller number than in other economies. And by the way, also we have far fewer taking what's terrible phraseology, but level 4 and 5 qualifications or higher level technical qualifications, much lower than in other successful countries. On the other hand, of course, the participation age in school has gone up, and so there are far more young people staying in education in some form till the age of 18. We've had, I think it's probably fair to say, something of a checkered history when it comes to our technical and vocational education, and the issues that have long been recognised. I've also, both when I was employment minister and I was education secretary, I was struck by the fact that every time you would meet a group of business people, a group of employers, the top thing they wanted to talk about almost every time was soft skills, the so-called employability skills. The terminology varies. There's been a huge expansion in recent times of higher education, and that's included some of the finest higher education in the world. But also there are some young people who have completed courses and had questions about whether it was as good as it could have been. In the recent past, of course, there has been huge employment growth. I mean, above and beyond any mainstream economists' projection, and young people have particularly benefited from that. We've also had important reforms to upgrade apprenticeships and more recently the introduction of T levels. In the wider economy, obviously the technology situation that young people come into now is very different from in my generation, and there are good parts and bad parts to that. I think it's lowered the barriers to starting a business on the internet, for example, and it's also facilitated the so-called platform or gig economy, which is a different way into work. And for some people, it works very well and I'm perfectly happy with it. There are also concerns about what some of the job security and other conditions might be. And then as for the future, again, it's a lot about technology and robotics, autonomous vehicles, machine learning, AI, voice computing. Any one of these things on its own could be a revolution in the way we do work, but they're all happening together. You'll hear people periodically saying 15%, I don't know, whatever percentage it is they say, of jobs, for primary school children today, some extraordinary percentage of them will go to jobs that don't yet exist. Well, I have no idea how those people could possibly know that, but we do know that there is going to be a lot of change, and that will include new opportunities, which we have to be ready to take. It will also include, I'm afraid, a lot of disruption that we and people individually and families will have to deal with. So for this coming generation, we need to understand the evolution in the skills that are required for success in business and at work, and for people and families in developing their careers and providing for their loved ones. And above all, I think what we need, given that the future is uncertain, is flexibility and adaptability. So we need to think both about the immediate situation for today's 20-somethings and also the prospects for today's themes. Just very quickly in the couple of minutes left, Fiona, I mentioned 5 themes. The first is about parity of esteem between the academic and the technical route. I am not the first person to bring this up in one of these type of sessions. People have talked about it for years. At every parliamentary debate we have, it's the first thing people talk about. You can't legislate for parity of esteem. What you can do is make sure that that there are very high quality routes on offer through both routes, and that people make that kind of choice. And I think we are well on our way, particularly through the Sainsbury report and the plan that's come out of that, which has strong cross-party support. I think one of the things we've all recognised is that for the future of our young people and preparing them for the workplace, these are medium to long-term projects, and there could be changes of government along the way, and it helps to all be in it together. But the reforms to apprenticeships and T levels, the simplification of qualifications and so on. But there is more to go on that, including in as I referred to, the the higher level technical qualifications. Second theme is about taking a broader view of skills. We often talk about an academic route and a vocational route. I just did. But in truth, they've never been wholly separate. And around the world today, with the knowledge economy, advanced engineering, and so-called mechatronics, they are merging further. And if you visit a country like Germany, it is really quite striking how much academic work apprentices are doing as part of their apprenticeship, and how broad a curriculum there is through secondary school, whether, you know, in German terms, whether you're in a selective school or whether you're in a secondary modern school, and so on. And I think it's very important that T-levels now on their growth path include not only the core vocational skill, but also English, maths, and digital. Third theme is it's a joint enterprise. We need firms, government, colleges, families, all in it together. Companies always say they want workplace skills to be improved. The best way to do that is to have people in work. And as well as providing job opportunities and apprenticeships, also for T-levels, we need British companies to provide industry placements on an unprecedented scale. Fourth theme, I'm nearly finished, Fiona, I know we're short of time. Fourth theme is about narrowing gaps. We've long had an issue in this country and others on social mobility, and some of the gaps that have been exacerbated by COVID to throw that into shot. But obviously in the immediate term, everyone's very focused on school and college and helping kids to get back to normality. We need to sharpen our focus on careers advice, building on the Gatsby benchmarks, and make sure that new opportunities are open to everybody. Nobody is talked out of one of these high opportunity careers. And finally, a recognition that there will be, I'm afraid, no end to change. For this generation, more than any previous generation, developing skills is not a one-off thing that will be done towards the end of formal education. It's going to carry on through life. Now, programs like the sector-based work academies work well. I'm encouraged by boot camps, or whatever you want to call it, but, you know, shorter, intense period. And I'd be interested to hear Stephen's view on this later as well. I think when people are out of work, I think there are more opportunities actually to use that time that's out of work to help to develop skills. And then, of course, later in life, we know that some of those technological changes are going to be affecting people all over again. And so, you know, the idea of a national skills fund, I think, is very helpful, but we've got a lot of work to do to develop the programs within it. Fiona, that's me done. Thank you very much for having me along.
That's great, Damien. Thank you. And I really appreciate that you've taken that kind of longer term look, because at the minute we have the current crisis, but there are, as you say, wider economic changes. And your final point about there'll be no end to change. Actually, we need to create young people who will grow up to be lifelong learners and develop skills and update them and retrain as they go. So I think that's really important. Thank you that we don't see this as a one-off incident, but think about how we have the right learning and skills system for the long term. Could I just, before I hand over to Stephen, could I ask you to share any thoughts about what you think might need to be done in the short term, as well as those long-term things, to ensure that young people's employment prospects, when they've fallen out of the labour market now, or indeed perhaps have been furloughed for 12 months and have been away from the labour market for a considerable amount of time, what more you think needs to be doing for those young people now, as well as these longer-term measures?
Well, some of what I said weren't longer term measures, they're measures right now. Yeah. And some of them have been in place for some time, and we need to scale them up. I mean, I want to maximise apprenticeship opportunities. We're on the real sort of intense growth part of the curve on T-levels. These are big and important things. In the very, very immediate term, so for people who are, you know, have been out of work or at risk of being long-term unemployed, the two key pieces of infrastructure that the government has put in place are Kickstart and Restart. And I know that Stephen's, he and colleagues will be all over, as we will throughout Parliament, scrutinising the effect of those programmes and making sure they're doing the job they're designed to do, and being flexible enough to change and to adjust to the patterns we see. The truth is, I mean, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, all economic predictions of what was going to happen in the employment market. Stephen's been shadow DWP secretary and a Treasury Minister. He knows this as well as I do. I mean, it is extraordinary if you look back a couple of years, I mean, to before COVID, but what was being projected for what was about to happen in the labour market, and it didn't. You have to be flexible enough to adjust. But we know some of the active labour market programmes that work well. I mentioned sector-based work academies have intensive activity period times for youngsters as well to help them get into it. But of course, the most important thing throughout all of this is the overall economy. If we can get the economy to bounce back that little bit more quickly, that makes as much difference as any as any program, and that's what we all have to be focused on.
That's brilliant, Damien. Thank you very much, and a great lineup for Stephen coming in next. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us. You're chair of the Work and Pensions Committee, and as Damien has mentioned, lots of expertise and experience over a considerable period of time to share with us. So, it'd be great to hear from you about what we need to do to face the future and help young people to do that after the pandemic.
Thank you, Fiona. And Damien's made some great points, and like him, I really welcome the spotlight that the Learning and Work Institute, Prince's Trust, HSBC are bringing to this topic with this welcome report, and the chance for us all to meet today to talk about it. So after the 2019 election, it took until March to set up the select committees. I chaired the first Work and Pensions Select Committee meeting at the beginning of March last year, and then we were into the pandemic, and that's obviously dominated our work since. We produced our first report in June of last year. That was about the department's response to coronavirus, including what was happening to young people, and we're continuing to look at issues affecting young people in the pandemic in our current inquiry on DWP's preparations for changes in the world of work, and we're planning to publish our report on that before the summer recess. But in our report last June, we made the point that young people historically have been among those hardest hit by unemployment in a downturn, and were likely to be particularly hard hit by this downturn. Sam Windett, who's taking part today, spoke to the committee in May last year, and our report actually quoted what she told us in giving 3 reasons, and Fiona, you've referred to some of these already. But firstly, 750,000 young people were already not in education, employment or training before the crisis started. Damien's right that young people had benefited from the high level of employment before the pandemic, but actually they hadn't had their full share of the benefits of that. There was still a lot of NEETs, and Sam's organisation pointed out that 3/4 of those who were NEET for 3 months had been NEET for 12 months. So a lot of young people before the pandemic were seriously stuck in worklessness. The second factor, and Fiona, you've touched on this, that young people were twice as likely as average to be working in sectors like hospitality, which was shut down by the pandemic. And the report launched today adds to that young people are overrepresented in the sectors that are forecast to see slower recoveries. And third, of course, there is the obvious fact that a lot of young people enter the labour market for the first time every year, and starting your working life in a pandemic when large chunks of the economy are closed is particularly hard. And we quoted also in our report what the Prince's Trust told us in our inquiry, which we very much endorse, that it is going to require a major national effort with lots of different partners working together. The Prince's Trust put it a collaborative approach, government, employers and third sector charitable organisations all working together if we are going to overcome this problem of rapidly increased youth unemployment. There is compelling evidence as well, and Fiona, you mentioned this, that Black young people have been especially hard hit, and that needs to be factored into policy in this area as well. So we recommended that the government should tailor its employment support carefully to the different needs of groups affected differently by the pandemic, with a particular focus on the needs of young people. I've been a supporter for a long time of the idea of a job guarantee. I welcome what your report talks about, a youth guarantee for all young people aged 16 to 24, a backstop job guarantee to, and I quote, create paid employment opportunities ring-fenced for young people who've been unemployed for 12 months or who've been referred by their work coach or a local partner. And we said in our report last June that job guarantees have been a feature of past labour market downturns in the UK and elsewhere. The TUC has called for government funding to offer a 6-month job with accredited training to every worker aged under 25 and unemployed for 3 or more months, and to every worker aged over 25 unemployed for over 6 months. And the classic initiative along these lines was the Future Jobs Fund, introduced in October 2009, aimed at 18 to 24-year-olds claiming job seekers allowance. It ran for 18 months, supported 105,000 jobs being created, cost £680 million. And the DWP conducted analysis and published it in November 2012, showing that the Future Jobs Fund had delivered a net benefit to participants of approximately £4,000 each, a net benefit to employers of approximately £6,850 per participant, and a net cost to the Exchequer of about £3,100 per participant. Netting off that cost from the benefits, that gives a net benefit to society of £7,750 per participant. That was the conclusion of the DWP's assessment. I think they're pretty impressive figures, and I think it is right to take some inspiration from them for the approach to tackling youth unemployment this time, 12 years later. And the government has shown interest in the idea. The Prime Minister has supported the idea of a guarantee. Last July, he said, and I quote, "For young people in particular, for whom the risk is highest of losing jobs, I think it's going to be vital that we guarantee apprenticeships." He told Robert Halfon, Conservative Chair of the Education Select Committee, who's advocated this, that the government would look at the idea of an apprenticeship guarantee, how it could be funded, how the government could work with business to deliver it. But unfortunately, nothing has come of that in the 9 months since. I think it's an important idea that ought to be pursued. One development which has come forward, which I warmly welcome, Damien has mentioned the introduction of the Kickstart scheme. It doesn't include the guarantee element of the Future Jobs Fund, but the model otherwise is pretty much the same. It's a big, very welcome £2 billion commitment to tackling youth unemployment, aiming to create hundreds of thousands of high quality work placements. Funding for each placement will cover 100% of the national minimum wage for 25 hours a week, plus employer national insurance and the minimum automatic enrolment contributions. The government also says it will provide, and I'm quoting, extra funding to support young people to build their experience and help them move into sustained employment after they've completed their Kickstart scheme funded job. Employers are expected to provide training and support to the Kickstarter to move on to a permanent job subsequently. I think it's a good programme. It does seem a bit slow to be getting started. In January, the DWP announced that 120,000 jobs for 16 to 24-year-olds had been approved on Kickstart, although very few had actually begun. At the beginning of February, giving evidence to my committee, the Secretary of State acknowledged that it had taken a bit of time to put things in place, but she expected, I quote, about another 30,000 in the next 4 to 6 weeks. In fact, 6 weeks later, middle of last month, there was only about 6,000 had started their placement. But hopefully, progress will now speed up as the programme gets up to speed. A couple of points about Kickstart. It is only available to people claiming universal credit. There have always been quite a lot of young people in the NEET category, who do not claim benefit. And evidence given to our inquiry supports the need for people who aren't claiming, including many young people, to be able to get the kind of support that Kickstart provides. At the moment, they can't get it. I think that ought to be changed. And another kind of detailed but important point about Kickstart is it needs to support disabled young people as well as others. We're inquiring at the moment in the Select Committee into the stubbornly high disability employment gap, which has hardly shifted since 2010. We don't know yet whether Kickstart is recording the disability status of participants so that they can tell whether it's delivering for disabled young people or not. The work programme didn't do a good job for young people. We need, for disabled people, we need Kickstart to do a good job for them. And I hope the department is going to deliver on that. So, you know, there's a great deal at stake in all this. Young people are being hit, have been hit especially hard by the pandemic. I think we do all now have an obligation to do what we can to minimize the lasting impact of those problems, those big scarring numbers that you presented at the start, Fiona, because if we just allow that scarring to take its toll, our economic prospects are going to be diminished for decades to come. We need to be really serious about this. I think Kickstart gives us a vehicle, but there's more that we need to do.
Thank you, Stephen, for your input there, and also for your work on the committee. There have been some questions in the chat about Kickstart, and I think very much people welcoming the programme, but concerns, as you say, about how the speed of progress and how we have fewer opportunities available at the minute than we would have liked to have seen, and what else we might do to both stimulate demand among employers and young people, and as you say, how we ensure we get to those young people who are most disadvantaged, thinking about as Black young people we've seen in the unemployment figures, thinking about disabled young people. Just wondered if there's anything you'd particularly like to see around support within Kickstart that would enable us both to get to the right young people and ensure labour market success for them.
Well, I would like to see a guarantee element added to it, so we're able to say to people this is guaranteed, as it was in the Future Jobs Fund. And I would like to see eligibility extended beyond those who claim universal credit, because otherwise, by definition, we're not going to be touching NEETs anything like to the extent that we should do. So those are two things that I'd like to see. I mean, the other thing, of course, that is coming along is the Restart programme, which is kind of the new version of the work programme. That can play a helpful role as well. But the detail, again, of how that's done is going to be quite important, I think.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen, for that contribution. If I can just say to those of you who are in the audience that we're just opening up our second poll now. If you could complete that, then that will enable us to reflect on your views as we get to the panel discussion. I'd like to turn now to Forrester Hurst, who is a young person supported by the Prince's Trust, to very much give us his perspective on young people's experience. So first of all, Forrester, I'd just like to ask you just to say something a little bit about your move into gaining work and the support that the Prince's Trust has offered you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yeah. So I started with the Prince's Trust last year in November. And I'll just give, before I go into that, I'll just give a brief outline of what I was doing beforehand. So I started, I'm 24 now, I started working in retail from the age of 16, and I did that for a good 5 years. And at that point, 5 years later, I realised I'm enjoying this. I've gained a lot of skills from working in a shop. And like we've said as well, a lot of young people do start working hospitality, retail, all that kind of thing. But I thought there's got to be more than life. I've got to be able. There's got to be skills that I have that I can use in plenty of different jobs. And about 5 months later, after I thought about that, I was working abroad for TUI, the holiday company, in the middle of Spain and living life. And I thought, hang on a second, there's got to be, that was a little bit too easy, because I've got one skill that I wanted to use, which was my people skills that I developed from working in a shop, and I'm now somehow working abroad. And I thought, wait, how has that happened? How has that been that easy to get into a completely different job that I now love? Obviously, I was doing that up to March of 2020 until, of course, COVID happened and I had to fly home. And that is when I did come across the Prince's Trust. And the Prince's Trust, in my opinion, I'm very surprised of how it's very underrated in my opinion. I feel a lot of younger people my age range don't know enough about it. I've had a lot of friends that I've said I'm doing a course with the Prince's Trust, and they've turned around and said I don't even know who the Prince's Trust are. And I thought, my goodness. And from the start of October last year, I have done 4 courses with the Prince's Trust. And put it this way, they're very, very different courses. I did a Kickstart course with Prince's Trust and Marks and Spencer's, which gave me a job over Christmas time. A job, may I add, that would have continued, obviously, if we weren't in the COVID-19 situation. But they had to furlough everybody. But since then, from the start of this year, I've managed to complete a stand-up comedy course, a marketing course, and I've actually just recently finished a health and fitness course, which were all very successful. But I was also able to find a link between all 4 of them, which was a link to the skill that I have. And I feel that the creativity in it all flowed over all of the courses that I did. And I was able to find this link between all of them, even though they're very, very different. That helped me out a great deal whilst learning other skills along the way. And I know Damien was talking about developing skills. I feel that a lot of different jobs out there that you can get just by having one skill can give you a knock-on effect of having a variety of different skills as well that would lead on to more jobs. And I mean, currently, after all the courses I've just done, I've now got 3 possible job opportunities since October that I could go into. So I feel like I'm just opening doors at the moment. And I feel like my time in lockdown has been a massive just learning curve of realizing there's so many opportunities out there, even if you just have one skill, which in my case was communication skills and people skills. And the Prince's Trust, yeah, in my opinion, very underrated. And I feel like a lot more people should know about it.
Thank you, Forrester. I think the thing that really struck me there is the combination of those courses. And so often, don't we think about, whether someone should go on a course and where it will lead, but actually developing a broad range of skills and being able to put them together, and kind of being creative about where that can lead is really important. There was a comment in the chat about, is our education meeting their needs of the labour markets? And it kind of links, I think, to your point, Damien, about people talking about soft skills. And so I think we need to also be quite creative and flexible about the pathways for young people that will help them get jobs now and jobs in the future as well. So thank you, Forrester, for that, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A. If you do have questions for our panel, then please do put them in the chat. Mincha, could we put up the results for the first poll before we go on to some of our panelists? Please, if we could share that on the screen. And our first panelist, here we go. So this is, we asked you which best reflects your prediction for youth unemployment. So what will happen over the summer and what will happen in the long run. And so just over half of you think that youth unemployment will continue to rise because of uncertainty and longer term trends. And so we will certainly need to think about how we support those young people back into the labour market, and that growing number of people who would have been outside of the labour market for a considerable while. Okay, thank you there. We'll come to the second poll shortly, but I'd like to now introduce our panel. So we have Sam Winder, who's currently Director of Policy at Impetus, although we have announced this week she will be joining Learning and Work as Deputy Director in the coming months. So welcome, Sam. We've also got Ben Marsden, who's Director of Partnerships at the Prince's Trust, and a great endorsement of the Prince's Trust from Forrester, and also Michaela Wright, who's Head of Sustainability at HSBC and supported both Prince's Trust and ourselves to do this work. So welcome all 3 of you. I wondered, Sam, if I could start off with you. I know you've been working on the Youth Employment Group through the pandemic, and I wondered, in your experience, what you think has been the most challenging aspect of the pandemic for young people's employment, and therefore how we should respond to that.
That's a good question, Fiona, and it is certainly not a lack of motivation on behalf of young people like Forrester, who've been doing so many courses and taking so many opportunities, as he has incredibly employable now, Forrester, which is great to see. One of the biggest challenges, I would say, the first one is very pertinent for us meeting today on Labour Market Statistics Day, is that overall, you would see the overall statistics that came out today as being, the labour market is starting to recover. Things are starting to look better. And one of the challenges has been the data and the averages, because underneath the averages, today we can see that young people are at a record low of numbers of young people under 25 on payroll. So the impact of the pandemic has not been felt equally amongst all age groups. And I think the reporting of that is very hard for us to combat. So through working through the Youth Employment Group and others and people in this meeting today, highlighting the impact specifically on young people has been really important. It's absolutely been, people talking about recovery looking like K-shaped or different shapes. For older workers, we've seen a pickup in these figures over the last months, and is certainly today as well. For young people, is continued to decline. So that's the first thing. And I think secondly, one of the hardest things that we found, and particularly why we started the Youth Employment Group before the first lockdown actually last year, was that we, as Damien sort of said, we were set up for record employment levels. So we were set up, all of our systems were set up for really great levels of employment, record unemployment, and actually we're disinvested in some of the support, we're disinvested in some of the systems that were there to support people into employment. So when the pandemic came, it hit so hard because a lot of those systems weren't ready to support those people. Furlough has taken a lot of that work, but still we've seen that young people have been falling in employment, and there's been a lack of vacancies for them to move into. So looking at those young people that Stephen referred to, those young people sitting outside the system, we have never had a very good joined up system for them. So the issue at the moment is, through a record rise in youth unemployment, actually some of those young people get pushed further to the back of the queue. And as Stephen sort of said, with some of these initiatives like Kickstart coming in, there's such a vast number of young people that could benefit from those opportunities, that actually some of the young people who could benefit most from them are actually less able to access them. So if you extended Kickstart and expanded it to other groups, then you might be able to support more of the young people who need it. And I think because, I think Damien and Stephen have both worked across different departments in government and seen these from different angles, there hasn't been a great join up right across government on how these things work together. So there's bits of the system at the moment that are being brought in, like youth hubs, which could do a great job at transforming the system for young people. But equally, there's other parts like apprenticeships that young people are really actually missing out on. And apprenticeships have tended to now go to people who are already in work rather than young people out of work. So there really needs to be a much better join up in all of these right across the system. So those are the main challenges I think we've been facing, Fiona.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. Ben, can we come to you? So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you at Prince's Trust have been supporting young people during the crisis, and how you've seen the pandemic interact with kind of existing challenges that young people had.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. So obviously when the pandemic began, we had to rapidly, like many organisations and many businesses, actually look at our services and how we best reach young people, and then how we can direct the resource we have in different ways to young people. I think the first thing we recognised is that, confidence, when you're young and you're trying to find work, confidence is such a critical sort of intangible factor. You've got to keep your confidence high, and when you haven't worked ever and you're trying to take your first step, it was clearly a big knock to confidence on quite a large scale for young people. And I think we'd seen in our own research that mental health amongst young people was at some of its lowest levels even before the pandemic, and so we were really concerned about the impacts on mental health. So we started doing a lot of what were wellbeing calls effectively, sort of keeping in touch. There was a lot of work we did to just keep young people feeling confident and motivated whilst we navigated and understood what kind of jobs were actually going to be available and what opportunities were going to be there. We obviously had to transition to online ways of working, and actually saw some real benefits of that, of young people feeling even more comfortable to interact in an online setting. But then there were some real disadvantages as well, particularly digital poverty and young people who don't have all the access. So we've learned a lot from doing all of that. And then I think latterly we continued our great partnership with healthcare and the NHS and got as many young people as we could into jobs in the NHS, which was an incredibly brave thing for young people to do actually during that time. And then latterly Kickstart, we were obviously, along with Sam and the Youth Employment Group and others, really calling for a form of a youth guarantee and an opportunity guarantee. Kickstart, we think is brilliant as an intervention, and we've done our best to support it. So we've run programs with Tesco, M&S, lots of retailers, and got a lot of other employers lined up ready to go on our own Kickstart schemes. So that's broadly what we've been doing. In terms of how the pandemic interacted with existing challenges, I think it's been well stated, but obviously there were some structural problems even before the pandemic that we saw in terms of a sort of a pressure on the entry level layer in traditional sectors like retail, leisure, hospitality, and the shift and transition to digital sectors, and the fact that those sectors were not, it was much harder to get into those sectors if you were young. So you could see that a sort of emerging structural problem, which I guess Damien touched on. It's related to skills. We certainly saw that, and I guess we'll see that coming out of COVID as well, as the need to look at interventions that encourage young people into the growth sectors and the sectors of the future, whilst recognising the role that those big sectors that have always employed young people still have to play. And then I think mental health, I mentioned it before, confidence. It's just really hard if you've been unemployed for a long time. And as Sam said, we've seen young people who are already disadvantaged, that large number that were already out of work actually, despite relative full unemployment, being pushed to the back of the queue, and the danger, as you've highlighted in the report, the scarring effect that can last a lifetime in terms of earnings and potential. So I think those are the main challenges, and I think it's just sort of accelerated some of those challenges in particularly the most disadvantaged young people.
Thank you, Ben. That's really helpful. Michaela, can we bring you in now? So I guess I'm interested from an employer's perspective about how you see young people's employment prospects in the medium term, and how we might address some of those challenges, perhaps the role that employers have to play.
Thanks, Fiona. I think a number have covered this, but we're all hoping the economy reopens and business and consumer confidence returns this summer. So, and lots of young people returning after furlough. Although we acknowledge that a number of sectors will take longer to recover, but I think Ben just mentioned this around sort of taking a step back and thinking about the scars that will remain for young people. And so from a challenge perspective, we know that those young people that have just come through college and are going into the workforce or onto apprenticeships or even onto university, their teaching has been massively disrupted. So it's for us, what's really important is that personal, and I think Damien talked about it a lot, the soft skills, the employment related skills development, which will be severely impacted, because of the isolation they felt, the lack of social interaction and remote learning. So at HSBC, and I expect a lot of employees have had to drastically change how they are recruiting young people. We also know that the workplace culture has changed, with home working, most of us doing all of this over Zoom as well. And I think to Ben's point, well-being has been key. It's been key to our programs for our own employees, but certainly to our HR programs as well. So we recognise that we had to sort of focus on helping increase confidence of young people, and those young people that are going to be the innovators of the future, the ones that are going to bring about all the change that we want to see. So a lot of our own programs had to change. There is one small upside with Zoom, and we all know this with webinars, etc., more people are able to attend. So we moved a lot of our interaction to virtual, and our work experience program specifically for young people has actually grown throughout COVID. And we now have a careers education program where we've been hosting workshops, insight days, career events. And in the last year, we hosted 50 of those events with over 60,000 young people attending. That just would not have been possible sort of pre-pandemic. So you can definitely reach more. That's not to say I don't believe that social interaction and face-to-face interaction isn't really important for those soft skills as well. But I would just say, as part of that, we partnered as well. And I think that's an important point about the need for collaboration here. And so we've partnered with schools, universities, charities like Ben and the Prince's Trust. And that helps ensure you're reaching some of the most vulnerable in the communities that find it harder to access work experience in our types of organisations. And we plan on expanding that even further this year.
That's great. Thank you, Michaela. I wonder if we could show the results for the second poll now, before we go on to questions from the audience, and please continue to put those through. So here are your options. It's your views of government action to reduce youth unemployment to date. So again, just over half for that top answer. Government's responded well, has yet to address several key areas that require longer term reform. What I suggest you do is you put some of those things in the chat and we can raise those as questions. Just for the panelists, there are lots of comments in the chat at the minute, and they generally revolve around two areas. So I think there's something around Kickstart, thinking about a longer time period, boosting numbers, thinking about eligibility. There's also something about whether we're teaching the right things to young people. And I wondered if I could ask you, Damien, first. There's a question about, are we preparing young people in their initial education with the right knowledge and skills in order to be able to find work as they transition into the labour market? And I guess a particular concern in one of the comments that as young people have to catch up on some learning that they might have lost, and that we focus heavily on the curriculum, whether we risk not putting due attention on some of those softer skills that you mentioned that will help them to find work once they leave education.
Well, thanks, Fiona. And I don't know who asked those questions, but I mean, I agree instinctively with what's implicit in the questions. First of all, that we have to, evolve and modernise, continue, keep on modernising our view of skills and knowledge that are required in the future. And secondly, that it's not all about what's on the exam paper or in the practical. It's also about all kinds of other things, some of which happen at school, some don't, or college, some don't. I touched a little bit earlier on workplace skills. I was running short of time. I didn't get to say some of what I would have done, but there is no substitute for being in work to learn workplace skills. And I'm going to guess that most people on this screen in front of me right now, we all did Saturday jobs or paper rounds or something. Far, far fewer young people do that these days. And that puts even more of a premium on young people having the experience of getting into an actual workplace and, developing all those behaviors and instincts that you get as a result of being work. But there's so much else as well. Team sports you get a lot from, and individual sport you get a lot from. Finding your thing that, I mean, Forrester, God, what an inspiration. He's got 4 things. That's amazing. And one of them is telling gags in public, something I wouldn't ever dare to do. Finding the thing that you can do that really, really kind of brings you out. That is an amazing and important thing. In terms of the core curriculum, English and maths remain incredibly important. And whenever there's a study done on this, it is striking how important it is. And there are hardly any jobs these days that don't require some degree of English, maths, and computer skills, digital skills as well. And so I think increasingly we need to build that into the fabric of how we do education and training. It's already, it's a core part of T levels. One final thought I'll give you back on breadth of education. And I touched this very, very briefly. Germany, which everybody looks to as the the kind of pinnacle of technical and vocational, certainly in Europe, probably in the world. It is so striking how broad in education those young people are getting. And I visited or in British terms, we call a secondary modern school in Dresden. And those young people were not spending all day, every day doing technicals. They were doing the English baccalaureate. I mean, it happened to be German rather than English, but they were doing the full kind of range. And I think, as I said in my remarks, I think, technical and academic are merging. And in the future, the knowledge economy requires, really high skills in both.
Thank you. Stephen, I know that you have to leave now, and I thank you for your time. I just wondered before you go, we've talked about the slow pace of Kickstart. Do you think there's a case for extending the duration in which the Kickstart programme runs, as well as expanding the eligibility to make sure that we gain momentum and meet young people's needs as this crisis unfolds?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the conclusion of your poll is right. We're going to have these problems for some time yet, and I think we are going to need the kind of support that's being put in place now, the beginnings of it, for a longer period than we've really reckoned up until now. The Future Jobs Fund lasted for 18 months, and my feeling at the time was it was cut shorter than it should have been. I think we need to see this commitment sustained over a longer period. I was very pleased to hear about what HSBC is doing. I think that message about collaboration, lots of different people coming together to tackle this really pressing national priority, government, education, businesses, the third sector. I think that's the way we've got to crack this.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to join us. I wondered if I could ask kind of wider panel members. I think some of the things that have come through your reflections are that actually there were some young people who were already struggling before we got to the pandemic, and there's a real danger that they could be left even further behind. I wondered kind of what your thoughts are about the balance between those big programmes that catch all young people and specific support for those hardest to reach, and what that should look like. I'm happy to come to any of you. I'm going to pick on Sam, but I guess, Ben, that you've probably got some thoughts on that from your wider work at Prince's Trust.
Happy to be picked on first and then pass over to others. I think you're exactly right, Fiona, when you sort of describe them as the big scale sort of programs that sit in departments. So, the biggest lever for the Department for Work and Pensions by far is the Job Centre, and that's an obvious lever to pull. But and things like Kickstart, you can plug in, Restart, as Stephen Timms mentioned. It will be coming on for those people in the system and those people claiming benefits. But for those young people that don't go to Job Centre and aren't sitting on universal credit at the moment, it's incredibly fragmented. And actually, when we look at things like the levelling up agenda, lots of people looking at how do we level up across the country. The focus on physical infrastructure often is to the disbenefit of things like employment and skill support and social infrastructure. These things have to go hand in hand. So if you're building a great roadway to a great business park in one area, then get the employment and skill support to the people in that locality so that they can take those jobs, and you can build a really vibrant local economy, create growth. I think at the moment it's a bit of a patchwork. And there's bits of funding, Community Renewal Fund, over here, and bits of funding over there. There's youth hubs that are trying to expand to more young people, and that as I mentioned, it could be a great transformation, but in early stages at the moment. And there isn't that coherence at the moment for those young people on where they can go and what they can access. So I think we need to do a lot more on that.
That's great, thanks, Sam. How about yourself, Ben?
Yeah, it's a really good, and it's quite a tough question, I think. So I think the simple answer is you do need both. And I think at a time where you've got the scale of the challenge in the high levels of youth unemployment that are we've yet to see a peak of, you do need the big programs that sort of stand out. It's interesting that Forrester was saying Prince's Trust itself is underrated. That's a marketing challenge, isn't it? And if you need young people, organizations and employers and the state to sort of come together, you've got to have some big initiatives, I think, that people can get around, and they deal with high volumes and high impact. But of course, you can only go so far with that. And I think there are some emerging opportunities. You know, we hope, Sam mentioned Community Renewal Fund, and the Shape of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund should be an opportunity to build the right sort of collaborations that still help young people outside of, you know, the net that's captured in those big schemes, you know, be picked up. And of course, I would say, but it's right, the third sector has got a big role to play. And as Michaela said, collaboration is key. And I think it's always a challenge in policy terms as to how do you facilitate those sort of longer term collaborations that are really needed as the kind of safety net to pick up those disadvantaged groups. And I just think that takes some clever policy making, really good collaboration amongst key organisations. Unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer, but I would say, because I haven't said it, we would certainly call for the extension of Kickstart, by the way. I think, you know, we think that is a programme that, given time, will really start to work, but probably needs to be given a bit more time.
Thank you, Ben. And just looking at the many comments in the chat, I think there's quite a lot of support for the extension of Kickstart, both in timescale, but also to think about those groups of young people who aren't currently eligible. So they're not on UC, groups like care leavers, but you know, people who without a programme like this could really risk being left behind. And so I think there's some changes we want to make, we'd like to see made to the Kickstart programme, as well as it continuing, because as we've said previously, it could have the potential to make a significant impact if we get this right. Forrester, I'd kind of want to come to you. Just, we've been talking about sort of the learning and skills that young people have to support them into the labour market and the support they have. I wondered if you could just sort of reflect on your own education, your own preparation for the labour market, if there were things that you found particularly helpful, or things that you thought might have been more helpful for people like you that we could think about putting in place now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, education-wise, I was not very good at all. So throughout my school life, I struggled with your simple education. Maths in particular, I had a very big struggle with. And one thing I can say is throughout my later school life, heading towards GCSEs, throughout that time frame, I know from a lot of my teachers, I was getting this impression that basically if you don't, and I can feed this into what we were talking about what we can bring to schools and what are we teaching people the right thing. But I got this impression that from my teachers that basically if you don't get a straight C, I mean, I think it's different now, but if you don't get a straight C in maths and English, it's game over. You're going to struggle throughout your whole life. There's nobody is going to employ you and everything. And that came with a massive weight on my shoulders. And I got fairly upset about it, to be honest. But my dream at the time was to go and learn music. And I realized that a lot of the creative courses that were in college at the time, they weren't focused that much on the maths and the English as to more of what you got in the actual, what grade you got in the actual subjects that you were wanting to study. And already on my first year at college, I felt like I'd proven half of my teachers wrong at school. And I thought to myself, why? Well, I'm in college, and I've managed to succeed to that. So, and like I said, I was under the impression that I wasn't going to get anywhere because of this maths and the maths and the English. And I do think to a certain extent that schools can be too hard on certain subjects. Obviously, they are very important, but I feel it's a bit like the analogy sort of trying to teach a fish how to walk instead of swim, where I feel like we could bring a lot more broader subjects into schools and teach a lot more broader things into schools that would maybe inspire younger people a little bit more. And that's one thing that I feel like could change before going into the labour market, going into different jobs, is that I feel schools could look into inspiring children a little bit more into the more creative industry. I know that my school in particular, I think it was 2 years ago, they decided to completely block out performing arts and focus more on academic subjects. And I think for that, it is quite upsetting, to be honest. And it is a bit like into what was said about the arts around COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of people in the House of Commons were turning round and saying people need to get a real job if they're in the performing arts, because that doesn't exist at the moment. And I feel that that is the way that the future's going at the moment. People are trying to get young people to do more academic subjects, even if they're not suited to it, basically. And like I said, I look at my career already, and I'm only 24, and I feel like I've succeeded so many different jobs that some of them I did need maths and English and obviously to go through with, but I feel like I've had a very successful career in different jobs so far, even if I didn't even, I never reached a C in maths, a C in English, but instead I feel like my creative mind helped me out the most, and also my confidence levels throughout all the different experiences I've done have helped me get to where, to seize different opportunities, and that it's helped me out a lot and made me a lot more confident. Again, even though I don't have these academic subjects that are really pushed in schools to, for the schools to say that you need this, otherwise you're not going to get by in life. And I think that is one of the things that do need to change. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Oh, thank you, Forrester. It's certainly given us lots of food for thought, and certainly comments in the chat. I think there's something, isn't there, about, we certainly recognise that employers are looking for good English and maths, but how do we do that in a way that encourages people to do well in those subjects and inspire people and encourage and build confidence, rather than perhaps your experience, which was more kind of daunting and off-putting and feeling like you didn't have a future. And thinking about how within the school system, we also think about what careers advice and other activities are there to help us think about the range of opportunities that young people can go into. Michaela, I wondered if I could bring you in. What's the role of employers in this? There's so many jobs, aren't there, that actually as a young person you may have no idea exist, or what they involve or how to do them. There's a role for lots of organisations. We need really good careers advice, but there's a role for employers too, perhaps thinking about showcasing some of those roles.
Yeah, I completely agree, Fiona. And as Forrester was talking, I was thinking about just the range of jobs we have in HSBC, at legal department, risk department, HR, and sustainability function. So, and I think it's really important. So a lot of our work experience days, we have some of our, different leaders across the organisation talk about their work experience. And I could really empathise with Forrester. I actually left school with no qualifications, and have masters and all sorts of things now, but I remember that feeling that you couldn't get anywhere in life without them. And I have to say it drove me in a different way, Forrester. I then went back to learning later on, and I haven't really stopped. But I do think it's important that we have people that can talk to young people about their work experience and how they got into those different roles, because most people didn't plan it, Fiona. I didn't have a big career path to get into sustainability, and I think I can probably talk for 50% of our workforce. And lots of organisations are like ours, which have a variety of, customer facing jobs, digital roles now. The call for those digital skills that Damien talked about are absolutely key, and all abilities as well, Fiona. I think that's one thing that could come out of COVID, is because we've got this hybrid of working. I think there'll be more opportunities for disabled young people, because they will be able to, they won't have the issues of having to travel to places, or if they don't like lots of people or noise. So I do think, we also need to take something from all of this. And again, yeah, so I think to your point, we do, and that's the education program that I talked about that our HR team are doing. And I'd love to see more in employers do that, and virtual allows you to showcase all of the different roles that are available as well.
Thank you, Michaela. And Damien, I wondered if we could kind of finish with you. There's quite a challenge there from Forrester's experience of kind of what's happening in our school system and how we infuse and engage young people, as well as kind of be, I suppose, realistic about the sorts of things that employers are looking for. I wonder what your response was.
Yeah, look, Fiona, I agree with that. And first of all, I mean, it was very inspiring to hear Forrester's story and everything he's achieved. I also thought that what you said, Fiona, actually was bang on. That there is a balance, and we need to make subjects accessible and enjoyable. Not everybody is going to enjoy every subject. That's just the reality of life. I didn't enjoy every subject at school, I guess. None of us did, but particularly for those ones that we know do, and they just do have a really, really high value, we need to make them as accessible as possible. But that doesn't mean you should narrow the curriculum. I do want to reassure you, by the way, Forrester, I never heard anybody in Parliament say that people in the creative industries should get a real job. Certainly not. The creative sector has been a massive, massive engine of economic growth and job creation in this country, and it's something we do particularly well, and I think actually part of that is making sure that every young person, when they're at school and in and out of school, has the opportunity to do some drama, some music, some artistic creation. On subject choice, by the way, we do have like one of the most flexible curriculums in the developed world. So again, if you go back to that school in Dresden and say, so what about the choices these young people are making for their public exams at 16? They look at you funny. They're like, no, these are the subjects you do, because that's what you do in secondary school. People make career choices later, but these are the subjects we study. And I think it's good that we have good flexibility, that people can pick up something that really matters to them, but also that there is that breadth of subjects, which gives you that rounded education.
That's great. Thank you. We'll have to wrap up the conversation now, but I'd really like to say thank you to Damien, to Stephen for those keynotes, and for Sam, Ben, Michaela, and of course Forrester for joining the panel. So thank you very much. Please continue the conversation and do check out the research